there is a word that has ruined one of the most interesting questions in archaeology. The word is mystical. Once something gets labelled mystical, it stops being investigated. It gets moved from the science shelf to the spirituality shelf, and the science shelf gets another book about Roman aqueducts instead. That is what happened to ley lines, and it is worth spending a few minutes on what actually got lost when it happened. In 1921, a businessman named Alfred Watkins was standing on a hillside in Herefordshire, England, looking at an Ordnance Survey map. He noticed that a series of ancient sites, stone mounds, old churches, standing stones, hilltop markers, fell into a straight line across the landscape, not approximately, exactly. He spent the next 4 years documenting hundreds of these alignments across Britain, published a book called The Old Straight Track, and proposed a specific, non-mystical explanation that prehistoric surveyors had laid out a network of straight travel and trade routes across Britain using sighting markers, the same way modern road engineers use benchmarks. He called the people who built them dodmen, from the old dialect word for a snail, because they carried their surveying rods on their backs the way a snail carries its shell. Academic archaeology ignored him. Then, in the 1960s, the counterculture found his book, and within a decade, Watkins' careful geometric observation had been buried under claims about Earth energy, UFO landing corridors, and supernatural power lines. The geometry was real. The explanation became impossible to take seriously. And here is the thing that matters. Nobody went back to check the geometry. Not because it was wrong, because it had been contaminated by association. That is not how science is supposed to work. But it is exactly how science actually works, more often than anyone in science is comfortable admitting. So let's go back to the geometry, and let's look at it without the mysticism, without the earth energy, without the 1960s, and ask what it actually shows. Start with the Romans. They built grid cities, hundreds of them across every territory the empire touched. The grid was so consistent, in the same orientation, the same proportions, the same central axes called the cardo and the decumanus, that archaeologists can identify Roman city layouts buried under modern European cities by looking at where the streets run. The grid of ancient Rome is still the street grid of Turin. It is still visible in Florence, in Cologne, in London. The standard explanation is that Romans were excellent engineers who invented systematic city planning. That explanation has one problem. The Romans themselves did not claim to have invented it. The writer Varro in the 1st century BC recorded explicitly that Romans founded their cities using what he called the Etruscan ritual. They credited the Etruscans, and the Etruscans built their own grid city at Marzabotto in the 6th century BC, before Rome was a serious power. So the Romans learned it from the Etruscans. The question is where the Etruscans learned it. And that question, in 2,000 years of classical scholarship, has never been settled. The leading candidates are Greece, the ancient Orient, or an indigenous Italian tradition that predates both. Each of those options moves the origin of systematic landscape geometry further back in time and further from the civilizations we normally credit with geometric sophistication. Each of those options also raises a quieter question. If the same geometry keeps appearing independently across cultures that had no documented contact, what exactly is being independently discovered? Now go to New Mexico, Chaco Canyon. Between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, the ancestral Pueblo people built one of the most remarkable architectural complexes in North American history. Multi-story stone buildings precisely aligned to solar and lunar events, organized around a network of roads that researchers only began documenting in the 1970s. The roads are 9 meters wide, in some places up to 30 feet. They run in straight lines, ignoring hills, ignoring valleys. In a few cases, staircases were cut into cliff faces so the roads could maintain their straight course rather than divert around the obstacle. The Chacoan people had no wheeled vehicles, no pack animals. The roads were not built for cargo. Archaeologists have known this for decades, and have been quietly disagreeing about what to do with that information ever since. The standard interpretation shifted toward cosmography. The roads were ritual, aligned with sacred landscape features, oriented to cardinal directions, more like infrastructure for the cosmos than infrastructure for commerce. That interpretation has a lot of evidence behind it. A study published in 2025 found that a Chacoan road near Gasco, New Mexico, previously thought to extend only a few hundred feet, actually runs for nearly 4 miles, and aligns precisely with the sunrise over Mount Taylor on the winter solstice. A second parallel road was found alongside it, following the same astronomical bearing. Built by a culture with no wheels, no animals, no written record, we can read, an exact solar alignment maintained over 4 miles of carved sandstone. The geometry is the same geometry. The Etruscan discipline divided its cities into quarters, then eighths, then sixteenths, oriented to cardinal directions. The Chacoan North Road maintains a near-perfect northerly bearing for 50 kilometers. The Roman Cardo runs north to south. The Decumanus runs east to west. Every culture is building the same grid, oriented to the same directions, at scales that exceed any obvious logistical requirement. And every culture, when asked where they learned it, either says they inherited it from someone earlier, or doesn't answer at all. Here is where the story gets specific in a way that has not been connected publicly before. In 2025, archaeologists finished mapping the underground infrastructure of Veii, an Etruscan city destroyed by Rome in 396 BC, long dismissed as a minor curiosity in the shadow of its conqueror. They used autonomous rovers built on technology developed for space exploration. What they found was not what the standard model of Etruscan urban development predicted. Beneath the city's sanctuary complex was a fully integrated hydraulic grid, channels directing water between ritual areas, cisterns at precise intervals, hidden galleries connecting the plateau to the valley below. The system was not improvised. It was engineered from the ground up as a single unified network with the above-ground architecture built over it, not the other way around. The underground grid came first. The city was built to match it. That detail is worth sitting with. The underground came first. Every pre-Roman city in Italy that has been fully surveyed shows the same pattern. The infrastructure precedes the buildings. The geometry precedes the settlement. Someone surveyed those sites before anyone lived on them, decided where the lines should run. And the cities grew up along the lines rather than the lines being laid down to serve the cities. Alfred Watkins noticed exactly this pattern in Britain. Ancient mounds, old stones, early churches, all on the same lines. He suggested the lines came first and the markers followed. He was dismissed. Not because his observation was wrong, but because the counterculture gave his observation a language that made it unspeakable in academic company. The geometry survived, the credibility didn't. And here is the final piece, the one that closes the question most people don't know to ask. The Romans said they learned geometry from the Etruscans. The Etruscans built grid cities before Rome existed. The Chacoan people built solar-aligned grid roads in a desert in New Mexico around the same time the Etruscans were being conquered. The Indus Valley civilization at Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago built a city with a street grid oriented to cardinal directions and a drainage system underneath that preceded the buildings above it. Nobody has funded a serious study asking whether these represent the transmission of a single geometric tradition across time and distance, or the repeated independent rediscovery of something so fundamental to how organized human settlement works that every culture arrives at it eventually. Both answers are interesting. Neither has been seriously investigated as a unified question. What has been funded is Roman aqueducts, Chacoan ceramics, Etruscan pottery, the infrastructure that precedes the infrastructure, the geometry that the infrastructure was built to serve. That question falls between disciplines, between archaeology and mathematics, between ancient history and engineering, between the thing on the shelf labelled mystical and the thing on the shelf labelled serious. It sits there, waiting for someone to pick it up and ask what it actually is. The grid is still under every ancient city on the planet. The lines are still in the landscape. The Chacoan roads are still carved into the sandstone. The Etruscan channels are still running under Italian cities that don't know they're there. And the question Watkins was actually asking, not about mystical energy, not about UFOs, but about who built the lines first, and whether they all learned it from the same place, has never been answered. Because the word mystical got there first. And science, like every other human institution, is very good at not picking up something someone else already dropped.